The unions have always been under the firing line by any Conservative government. The fact is they're usually the first on the frame to be attacked as well. Actually, I welcome Mike Ballard up here. He's a retired member of the AMWU. And just because you're retired, you might be retired from the workforce, but never from the struggle. Because elderly people are copping this as well. So please welcome Mike Ballard, retired member of the AMWU.
Thank you. I was listening to Radio National last year, and it was a breakfast program, and Fran Kelly was interviewing Julie Bishop about the current economic slump and what we're going to do about it. And one of the things she was talking about was the taxes. And Julie said, we should have a mature discussion about our tax systems, and that would include the GST. Okay, so I'm here to contribute to that discussion, that mature discussion. But first I want to establish what it is that wealth is and where it comes from. And to do that, I want to ask you all a question. How much wealth would be produced in May if everyone who depends on wages to make a living went on a general strike from May 1st to May 31st? Zero! That's right, zero wealth would be produced. Now we know where wealth is produced. It's produced by us and it's produced for wages. Now the second thing we want to know is, how is that wealth divided? And the way we can find out is by looking at something that you can Google. It's Credit Suisse report. It's an annual report of wealth. And in that it shows that the upper 10% of the population own 80% of the wealth that the bottom 90% produce. Okay? This happens all over the world. This is like a systemic thing all over the world, and it happens in Australia too. And a systemic thing is called the wage system. Okay? So what's happening in Australia, and has happened since 1975 when Gough got the royal axe, is that there has been a new ideology come about that's been glommed down by the political establishment, and it's called trickle-down economics. And trickle-down economics is basically says that forget about us producing the wealth. The wealth is actually given to us by the top class, by the upper 10%, the ones who own 80% of the wealth. Now that 80% of the wealth that they own, basically that's all the companies. The 1% own most of the companies. Then they own most of the shares. They own most of their investment real estate. They own most of the government bonds and corporate bonds. That's the wealth that they own, and that's the wealth that the conservatives want to protect. And the way they protect it is through this economic theory called trickle down, which is still extant. If the political establishment still believes you can't raise taxes on business. In fact, you have to cut taxes on business. Now, what happened on the march from the end of the Whitlam era to the present is that this theory took over the political establishment, and the people who produce the wealth, you, the wage workers, you suffered a 15% cut in the amount of wealth that you get from the GDP. And that's borne out by a study that was produced by the ACTU. Okay? So you're producing ever more wealth. Ever more wealth is being produced every year. The Australian Bureau of Statistics says that the real wealth of Australia has grown measured as the GDP, the gross domestic product, or more properly, the gross domestic product of labor. It's grown 2 to 3% in real terms since 1975, and yet we can't afford free education like we had in 1975. And yet there are these attacks on people going to the doctor. Now they want to send us a price signal saying that we shouldn't go to the doctor. Okay? Well, this is all a bunch of bull. And the reality is that there's more wealth produced every year, and there's more tax cuts happening for the top 10% all the time. Now, that march from 75 to the present, through the 80s, we know we had Reagan and Thatcherism, That was basically our product of trickle-down economics. And what happened is that the business tax was 49% in 1986. Okay? Hawke lowered it to 39% in 1988. And then when Howard got in, he lowered it to 30%. And now what's going to happen in July is they're going to lower it to 28.5%. And they're wondering why there's a budget deficit? Yeah. There's a budget deficit because they're not taxing the people who have the wealth. And they're just not going to, and if you send a message to them, you send them a price signal, like they're trying to send us a price signal. You send them a price signal and say, well, you're not going to be elected. You're not going to be in government if you don't start taxing the wealth of the upper 10%. Now, because it has grown 2 to 3% every year since 75, and according to the intergenerational report, we're going to be producing twice the amount of wealth per capita in 2055 as we do today. So just be aware that what happens all the time is that the conservatives, what they'll do is during a boom is they'll cut taxes for the upper 10%. They'll give them negative gearing, which loses $5 billion to the budget every year. They'll give $4.5 billion a year in tax concessions to the mining capitalists. They'll let tax loopholes galore explode, and you'll lose. The 34% of the multinationals will pay zero tax. And 25% of the top 100 companies on the AXX will pay zero tax, and the rest of them will fool around and pay about 10% tax. So there's plenty of wealth out there to fund an adequate social wage. There's plenty of money for social housing. There's plenty of wealth. It just needs to be tapped, and that's what we should tell them. We're not going to elect you unless you tap into that wealth.
There's one thing about our retired people, they say it as it is. And they've got years of struggle, so there's a lot to learn from them as well.